Morning light filtered lazily through the thin curtains, painting patterns on the wooden floor of the living room like washed-out watercolors. Thomas and Rachel's house, a neat two-story cottage in suburban Columbus, Ohio, looked like something out of a picture. A white facade, a manicured lawn, a pair of maple trees lining the driveway, and a porch swing that creaked in the breeze. Inside, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and toast filled the air, and the muffled clink of dishes came from the kitchen. This morning, however, was no ordinary morning. Thomas was getting ready for a business trip, and the house, despite its outward idyllic appearance, seemed slightly taut, like a string ready to snap at the slightest touch. Rachel stood at the stove, deftly flipping pancakes in the frying pan. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical, but there was a subtle tension at the corners of her lips. She was dressed in a light beige sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, and from the outside it seemed like she was the epitome of a caring wife and mother preparing breakfast for her family. But her gaze, sliding to the clock above the sink, betrayed something else. She was counting the minutes until Thomas left. "Jake, honey, come down. The pancakes are ready," she called, trying to make her voice sound warm and natural. There was silence in response, only the slight creak of the floorboards above indicating that her son had heard. Thomas was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through something on his tablet, his suitcase already by the front door, neatly packed and tagged with the airline. Tall, with a touch of gray at the temples, he looked like a man who was used to being in control. His dark blue suit was impeccably pressed, and his thin-framed glasses added to his intelligence. But today there was a slight fidgeting in his movements, as if he himself was not entirely sure of what he was doing. "Are you sure you can handle it?" he asked, not taking his eyes off the screen. "I can ask my mom to come over for a couple of days if necessary." Rachel turned, holding a plate of golden pancakes, and smiled the same smile she had honed over the years, warm, reassuring, but not too sincere. "Tom, everything will be fine. Jake and I won't get lost. You know I can keep things under control," she replied, setting the plate on the table. Her voice was soft, but there was a subtle edge to it, as if she wanted to get the subject over with. Thomas nodded, but his gaze lingered on her a little longer than usual. He was about to say something, but at that moment Jake came down the stairs. The 16-year-old boy looked sleepy. His dark hair was sticking out in all directions, and his t-shirt with the logo of some video game was slightly wrinkled. He dropped his backpack by the door and silently plopped down on a chair, immediately reaching for the pancakes. "Good morning, champion," Thomas said, trying to catch his son's eye. "How did you sleep?" Jake shrugged, not looking up from his plate. "It's fine," he muttered, spreading jam on a pancake. His voice was quiet, but there was some childish resentment in it that he was trying to hide. Rachel noticed this and immediately got involved, as if it was her job to smooth out all the rough edges. "Jake, Daddy's leaving today, remember?" she said, sitting down across from her son and pushing a glass of orange juice toward him. "Maybe you could say something to him before you leave. He'll miss you." Jake finally looked up, a mixture of sadness and irritation flickering in his brown eyes. He glanced at his father, then at his mother, and then dropped his head again. "Good luck out there, Dad," he muttered, picking at his pancake with his fork. Thomas smiled, but it was a strained smile. He reached out and ruffled Jake's hair slightly, though Jake pulled away immediately. "Thank you, son. I'll try to call every evening, okay? And you write if anything. Agreed?" "Yeah," Jake replied, but his tone suggested he didn't really believe in these calls. Rachel watched the scene, holding her coffee mug in her hands. Her fingers tightened lightly around the ceramic handle, but she relaxed, as if reminding herself that everything had to look perfect. She stood up to pour more coffee and called over her shoulder. "Tom, the taxi has already arrived. I saw it through the window." Thomas glanced at his watch, nodded, and stood up from the table. He walked over to Jake, put his hand on his shoulder, and said, "Take care of your mom, okay? You're in charge now." Jake just nodded, not looking at his father. Thomas sighed, picked up his suitcase, and headed for the door. Rachel followed him, fixing her hair and plastering another smile on her face. The taxi was already waiting on the porch, the engine purring quietly, the driver scrolling through something on his phone. Thomas stopped at the door, turned to Rachel, and looked at her as if trying to see something behind her perfect mask. "I'll be back in 3 months," he said quietly. "Call me if you need anything. And keep an eye on Jake. He doesn't seem thrilled." "It'll be fine," Rachel said, her voice almost musical, but slightly tired. "You know I can handle it. Good luck in Chicago, Tom. Don't stay out too late." She leaned over and kissed him on the cheek, a brief, almost formal kiss that lasted just long enough not to arouse suspicion. Thomas nodded, glanced at her again, then at the house, and got into a taxi. The door slammed, the car pulled away slowly, and Rachel stood on the porch, watching the yellow cab disappear around the corner. She took a deep breath, as if she were lifting an invisible weight off her shoulders, and went back into the house. Jake was still sitting at the table, but now he wasn't eating, he was just looking out the window, where the car had just driven away. "Hey," Rachel called softly, sitting down next to her. "Are you okay?" Jake shrugged, as if that was his one-size-fits-all answer to everything. "He's always leaving," he said finally, and there was more sadness in his voice than anger. "And he always says he'll call, and then he doesn't." Rachel felt something tighten in her chest, but she quickly regained her composure. She reached out and squeezed his hand lightly. "Dad's busy, you know. This trip is important for his job. But he loves you, Jake. And I'm here. We'll get through this, right?" Jake looked at her, and for a second, it looked like he wanted to say something, but instead he just nodded and stood up from the table. "I have to go to school," he muttered, grabbing his backpack. "See you later." "I'll drive you," Rachel offered, but Jake was already shaking his head. "I'm on the bus. Everything's fine." He walked away, leaving her alone in the kitchen. The silence fell like a heavy blanket, and Rachel suddenly felt her shoulders sag. She looked at Thomas's half-drunk coffee, at Jake's plate with his half-eaten pancake, and exhaled slowly. Her fingers ran along the edge of the table, as if searching for something to grab onto. The rest of the morning passed in a kind of automatic mode. Rachel cleared the table, loaded the dishwasher, answered a couple of work emails. She worked remotely as an editor at a small publishing house, which allowed her to maintain the image of the perfect housewife without sacrificing her career. But her mind was elsewhere. Every now and then, she caught herself looking out the window at the empty driveway, and each time she shooed the thoughts away like pesky flies. By midday, she decided she needed to do something. She picked up her phone, opened the Notes app, and began making a to-do list. Grocery shopping, signing up Jake for basketball practice, checking to see if the lawn was time to mow. The usual, routine things that kept her life on track. But when she got to the part about calling Tom, her finger hovered over the screen. She closed the app, tossed the phone on the couch, and went upstairs to change. In the bedroom, standing in front of the mirror, Rachel looked closely at her reflection. She was 37, but she looked younger, thanks to her morning runs, expensive face cream, and her ability to choose clothes that emphasized her figure. She adjusted a strand of hair that had fallen on her forehead and suddenly caught herself thinking that she had not looked at herself the way she used to, with pride or pleasure, for a long time. Now it was more of a control, a check that everything was in place, that everything corresponded to the picture she had so carefully created. She opened her closet, picked out a light dress and sneakers, the perfect balance between comfort and style, and headed downstairs. She had to pick up Jake from school and then stop at the supermarket. A normal day, normal errands. But something in the air, in the silence of the house, in her own thoughts, seemed off, as if someone had turned the lens slightly and the perfect picture was starting to blur. At school, Jake walked out to the car in silence, throwing his backpack in the back seat. He wasn't the type of kid who was happy to share the details of his day, but today his silence was heavier than usual. "How was your day?" Rachel asked, trying to sound casual as they pulled out of the parking lot. "Fine," Jake replied, looking out the window, his fingers fiddling nervously with the strap of his backpack. Was there anything interesting? She persisted. Nothing, Mom. Homework, as usual. He turned to her, and a flicker of genuine weariness flashed in his gaze. Can I just listen to some music? Rachel nodded, though something inside her tugged. She turned on the radio, and the soft chords of the guitar filled the car. Jake put on his headphones, blocking out the world, and Rachel was alone with her thoughts. She thought about Thomas, about him leaving, about the way he'd looked at her before he got into the cab. She thought about Jake, about his short answers, and how he was getting further and further away, and about herself, who she'd been before all this, before this house, this family, this picture-perfect image she'd worked so hard to maintain. At the supermarket, she followed her usual route. Vegetables, milk, bread, some meat for dinner. Jake followed behind, his head buried in his phone. At the checkout, he suddenly asked, Mom, is Dad really going to call every evening? Rachel froze, holding the pack of pasta in her hands. She looked at her son, trying to understand what was behind the question. Of course it will, she answered, trying to sound confident. He promised. Jake nodded, but his eyes told her he didn't believe her. And in that moment, Rachel realized she was having a hard time believing that promise herself. She paid for her groceries, and they walked out into the parking lot, where the evening sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky a soft pink. At home, Rachel began to cook dinner spaghetti with meat sauce, Jake's favorite. She hoped that the food would ease the tension, but as soon as Jake ate, he went to his room, citing homework. Rachel remained in the kitchen, staring at the empty plates. The silence fell again, and this time it seemed even heavier. She picked up her phone, opened the messenger, and wrote to Thomas. Did you get there okay? Jake misses you. She sent the message and immediately regretted it. She didn't want to seem weak, needing his attention. But the answer came almost immediately. Yeah, everything's fine. Just checked in. I'll call tomorrow. Short, businesslike, without unnecessary words. Rachel looked at the screen, feeling some strange irritation mixed with relief growing inside her. She turned off the light in the kitchen and went up to the bedroom. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling for a long time, listening to the sounds of the house. The creaking of the floorboards, the distant hum of a car outside the window, the quiet hum of the refrigerator downstairs. She thought she should feel something: sadness, loneliness, relief, perhaps, that Thomas was gone. But instead, there was only emptiness, as if someone had turned off the sound in her own life. Tomorrow would be a new day, she thought. A new day to keep everything under control, to maintain this picture-perfect image. But somewhere deep inside, she knew that the cracks were already beginning to appear, and sooner or later they would have to look at what was underneath. The school bus hissed to a stop at the corner, releasing Jake into a cloud of warm afternoon air. It was just after 3 in the afternoon, and the sun was low, casting long shadows from the maple trees that lined the sidewalk. Jake walked home faster than usual, backpack slung casually over one shoulder. His math teacher had called in sick, and his last period had been canceled, giving him an extra hour of freedom. He hadn't told his mother, not because he wanted to surprise her, but because he didn't see the point. She had seemed distant these days, as if her mind was elsewhere, and Jake didn't want to bother her. The street was quiet, save for the distant bark of a dog and the gentle breeze rustling the leaves. Jake shoved his hands into the pockets of his jeans, kicked a pebble on the sidewalk, and mentally planned out how he would spend the evening. Maybe play a new game on his computer or watch a blogger's live stream. He was already picturing himself in his room with a can of Coke when he turned the corner and saw their house. The white facade, familiar down to every crack in the paint, looked the same as ever, but something made Jake slow down. There was a strange car in the driveway, a dark blue pickup he'd never seen before. It was odd. His mother rarely invited guests, especially when his dad was out. He stopped, squinting, trying to make out the license plate, but the sun was in his eyes, and he couldn't make out the numbers. His heart skipped a beat, not from fear, but from some vague premonition. Jake adjusted his backpack and decided to go in the back door, the one that led through the kitchen. That way he could slip into his room unnoticed, without attracting attention if his mother was busy. He walked around the house, trying to walk quietly, although he didn't know why he was doing it. The back door was ajar, and voices were coming from the kitchen low, male and mom's, but different, not like usual. Jake froze, pressing himself against the wall next to the door. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but something about the tone of their voices made him wary. Mom's laugh, light, almost playful, was not at all like the kind he was used to hearing when she talked to Dad or him. It was a laugh he couldn't associate with her neatly pulled back hair and perfectly ironed sweaters. "Are you serious?" A deep, slightly hoarse male voice said. He didn't even notice. "Rach, you're a master of disguise." "Don't call me that," Mom said, but there was no irritation in her voice, more of a flirtatious tone that Jake had never heard before. And yeah, he doesn't notice. He never has. Jake felt the blood rush to his cheeks. He didn't understand what they were talking about, but the words, "he doesn't notice anything," cut him like a knife. He carefully, almost on tiptoe, peered through the crack of the half-open door. What he saw made his stomach clench and his breath catch in his throat. In the kitchen, right next to the counter where Mom had made pancakes that morning, she was standing there, wearing the same beige sweater, but with her hair down, falling in soft waves over her shoulders. Next to her was a man tall, with dark hair, wearing a denim jacket and faded jeans. His hand was on Mom's waist, and the other was casually touching her neck, as if it were the most natural movement in the world. They were standing so close that their faces were almost touching, and Mom was smiling, not the forced smile she'd given Dad before he left, but a real, lively one, with sparkles in her eyes. "You're so beautiful when you're not pretending," the man said, leaning closer. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but Jake heard every word. "Damn, Ratch, I can't stop thinking about you." Mom laughed, throwing her head back, and her hand slid down the man's chest, lingering on the buttons of his shirt. "You're incorrigible, Dan," she replied, and there was so much warmth in her voice that Jake felt his knees buckle. "Come here." And then they kissed. Not the way Mom kissed Dad, short and formal, but hungrily, like they couldn't get enough of each other. His hand slid lower, to her hip, and he pulled her even closer, so that their bodies merged into one movement. Jake watched as Mom's fingers tangled in his hair as she pressed herself against him, and it was so wrong, so foreign, that he felt like the world around him was cracking like glass. "You're driving me crazy," the man muttered, breaking away from her lips, but immediately kissing her neck. "If you only knew what I wanted to do to you." "Then do it," Mom said, her voice hoarse, full of some wild desire Jake had never associated with her. "Not here, up there." Jake backed away from the door, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure they could hear him. He pressed his hand to his chest, trying to stop himself from shaking, but his legs carried him back to the corner of the house. He leaned against the wall, feeling the cold brick seep through his t-shirt. His thoughts were tangled like the wires in an old box. This was his mom, making him pancakes, checking his homework, promising that everything would be okay while his dad was away. But it wasn't her. It was some other woman, a stranger, kissing a strange man and saying things Jake couldn't even repeat out loud. And now the comments. "Where are you watching us from, and do you have any unusual stories of your own?" He clenched his fists, trying to figure out what to do. Run into the house and scream. Say he saw it? But the thought of it made his throat tighten, like someone had tightened a noose around it. He couldn't do that. Not now. Not when he didn't even know what was happening. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe he was seeing things wrong. But the image of his mother's hand sliding down the man's back was seared into his head. Jake heard footsteps inside the house, the creaking of the stairs they were indeed going up. He didn't know how much time he had, but he knew he couldn't stay here. He walked around the house, trying to make as little noise as possible, and slipped through the front door, which his mother had apparently forgotten to lock. It was quiet inside, except for the sound of a door slamming somewhere upstairs. Jake stood in the hallway, listening. His backpack was still slung over his shoulder, and he suddenly realized he didn't know where to go. His room was upstairs, but he couldn't go up there now. He didn't want to. He wasn't ready. He walked slowly, almost silently, into the living room and sank down onto the couch. His hands were shaking, and he tucked them underneath himself to stop them. His mother's phone was on the coffee table, the screen glowing. She must have forgotten to turn it off. Jake looked at it, and for a moment he thought about picking it up, checking who this Dan was, but he pushed the thought away. It was too much. Too scary. Instead, he pulled out his phone and put on his headphones, turning on the first playlist he could find. The music drowned out the sounds of the house, but it couldn't drown out his thoughts. He closed his eyes, trying to imagine that he hadn't seen anything, that he had just come home like he always did, and that his mother would come down any minute, ask how his day had gone, and everything would be like before. But the image of that kiss, those words, that strange man kept coming back, like a broken record. It must have been about 20 minutes before he heard footsteps on the stairs. Jake quickly pulled out his earphones and pretended to scroll through his phone. His mother walked into the living room, and he couldn't help but flinch when he saw her. She looked like she always did, her hair pulled back into a bun, her sweater tucked neatly into her jeans, that same smile she always wore like a mask. "Jake," she cried, and her voice was so warm, so normal, that for a second he almost believed he had imagined it all. "When did you get back? I didn't hear you." "Just now," he lied, not looking up from his phone. His voice was hoarse, and he cleared his throat to cover it. Class was canceled. "Oh, great," Rachel said, coming closer. She sat down on the couch next to him, and Jake felt his body tense. He was afraid to look at her, afraid she'd see something in his eyes. "Want to order pizza for dinner? I'm not really in the mood to cook." "Yeah, fine," he muttered, still staring at the screen, his fingers scrolling mindlessly through the feed, though he couldn't see anything. Rachel leaned in a little closer, and he caught a whiff of her perfume, light, floral, the same scent he had always associated with her. But now it seemed foreign, like it belonged to that other woman he had seen in the kitchen. "Are you okay, honey?" she asked, her voice full of concern. "You're so quiet." "Just tired," Jake said, finally looking up at her. He forced a smile, but it came out crooked and unnatural. "It's okay, Mom." She looked at him, and for a second he thought she suspected something. But then she nodded, patted his shoulder, and stood up. "Okay, then I'll order pizza. Pepperoni, as usual?" "Yes," he nodded, feeling his throat tighten again. Rachel went into the kitchen, and Jake sat there, staring into space. He could hear her on the phone, ordering food, her voice as light and casual as ever. But now he knew there was something else behind that voice. Something he didn't understand, but that scared the living daylights out of him. The rest of the evening was a blur. The pizza arrived, and they ate it while sitting in front of the TV, where an old sitcom was playing. Rachel laughed at the jokes and made comments, but Jake barely heard her. He picked at his pizza, giving monosyllabic answers, all the while thinking about what he'd seen. Who was Dan? Why was his mother talking to him like that? And why was she acting like nothing had happened? When he finally made it up to his room, closing the door behind him, he felt his knees buckle. He sat on his bed, burying his face in his hands, and tried to breathe deeply. He wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything, but instead he just sat there, staring at his sneakers. He couldn't tell his mom that he'd seen her. He couldn't ask who the man was. He couldn't even call his dad. What would he tell him? Dad, was Mom kissing some dude? The thought made him sick. He lay down on his bed, still dressed, and stared at the ceiling. His mind was filled with fragments of their conversation, images he wanted to forget, but that kept coming back. He didn't know what to do, but he knew one thing. He couldn't pretend he hadn't seen anything. He couldn't just go on as if everything was normal. But he also couldn't destroy this fragile illusion that his mother had worked so hard to maintain. Somewhere downstairs, a door slammed, probably Mom taking out the trash. Jake closed his eyes, trying to imagine that tomorrow would be different, that he would wake up and this would be a dream. But deep down, he knew it wasn't a dream, and that this crack in their perfect life was just starting to grow. Jake lay on his bed, staring at the dark ceiling of his room, where the dim light from the street lamp cast streaks through the blinds. The clock on his nightstand said midnight, but he couldn't sleep. He'd barely slept for the past few days, replaying the scene in the kitchen in his head. His mother's laughter, someone else's hand on her waist, the words that burned like hot iron. He tried to convince himself that it was a one-time thing, that maybe he'd misunderstood, but something inside him told him the truth was worse. And that something nagged at him like a splinter he couldn't get out. He rolled over onto his side, pulling the covers up to his chin, when he heard a soft creak coming from downstairs. The house was old, the floorboards often making noise, but this was different, purposeful, as if someone was trying to move quietly. Jake strained, listening. The creak came again, and then the muffled sound of a door closing. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding. It wasn't the first night he'd noticed his mother leaving. At first, he'd thought she was just taking out the trash or checking the mail, but twice in the last week she'd come home just before dawn, her steps light, almost stealthy, as if she didn't want him to know. Jake stood up quietly, careful not to step on the creaky floorboard by the door. He opened the door to his room and peered out into the hallway. The lights downstairs were off, but a faint glow of moonlight was filtering through the living room window, and he saw his mother, dressed in a dark coat, walk quietly to the front door. Her hair was down, and over her shoulder was a small bag, the kind she usually took when she went jogging. But it was nighttime, and jogging at midnight was not her habit. He waited until the door clicked quietly shut, then crept to the window in his room that looked out onto the driveway. His mother was standing by the car, not the family minivan, but the same dark blue pickup he'd seen that day. The door opened, and she climbed into the passenger seat. Jake couldn't see the driver, but his heart sank with a familiar feeling, a mixture of fear and disgust. The car drove away slowly, headlights flashing along the neighbors' fences, and soon it was gone around the corner. He returned to his bed, but now he was completely lost to sleep. A swarm of questions swirled in his head. Where was she going? With whom? And why was she doing this secretly? He felt betrayed, but at the same time ashamed of these thoughts. This was his mother. Maybe he was getting it all wrong. Maybe she had a reason. But the image of that man, Dan, and her husky voice, full of desire, gave him no peace. The next few days were strangely tense. Jake began to pay closer attention to his mother, even though he hated himself for it. He noticed little things that had escaped him before. The way she sat with her phone for long periods of time, smiling at something on the screen, the way her voice rose slightly when she answered calls that she would quickly reject if Jake was around. One day, when she went out to the store, he couldn't resist and picked up her phone, which she had left on the kitchen table. The screen was locked, but there was a notification. Dan, tomorrow at 10, at my place. Jake felt his cheeks heat up and quickly put the phone back down, as if it had burned his hands. He didn't know what to do with this knowledge. Tell Dad? But Dad was in Chicago, busy with his work, and Jake wasn't even sure he'd believe it. And how could he say it? Dad, Mom's dating some guy? The thought of it made his throat tighten. He felt small, helpless, like the world he knew was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. On Friday, a week after he first saw his mother with Dan, things got even worse. Jake woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise, not the creaking of floorboards, but something heavier, like someone tripping over the threshold. He glanced at his watch, 2:47. His heart started pounding again, but this time he didn't hide under the covers. He stood up, put on his sneakers, and walked quietly down the stairs, holding on to the banister so as not to make a sound. The living room was dark, but a street light shone through the window, and Jake saw his mother enter the house, but not alone. A man followed her, not Dan, another man, with short blonde hair and a leather jacket. He was taller, broader in the shoulders, and his movements were sharp, almost aggressive. Another man followed him, a thin man with long hair pulled back into a ponytail. Jake pressed himself against the wall in the hallway, his breathing shallow, his palms sweating. "Hush, guys," Mom whispered, her voice nervous but still holding that playful edge he'd heard in the kitchen with Dan. "Don't wake Jake." "Relax, Ratch," the blond man said, his voice loud and slightly accented, something Jake couldn't place. "Your boy's sleeping like a log. Let's get a drink." "Yeah, go ahead," the other one, the one with the tail, chimed in. He stepped closer to his mom, and Jake saw his hand slide down her back, too low, too intimate. "You promised us a fun night." Mom laughed, but it was a forced laugh, as if she was trying to keep the situation under control. "It'll be all right, boys," she replied, retreating toward the kitchen. "Just no noise, okay? Come on, there's a bar." They walked into the kitchen, and Jake heard the cabinet door open, the clink of glasses. He stood frozen, unable to move. His thoughts were jumbled. Who were these people? Why were they here? And why did his mother let them do this? He felt anger flaring in his chest, but it was mixed with shame, with some dirty, sticky feeling he couldn't name. He wanted to rush into the kitchen, to scream, to chase them away, but his feet were rooted to the floor. He crept closer, hiding around the corner. Through the half-open kitchen door, he could see his mother standing at the counter, pouring wine into glasses. The blond man, the one with the accent, was standing too close, his hand on her thigh, the other casually spinning the bottle on the table. The man with the ponytail was leaning back in his chair, looking at his mother with a smirk that made Jake's stomach churn. "Are you always this welcoming, Ratch?" the blond man said, leaning toward her. His lips almost touched her ear, and Jake saw his mother pull away slightly, but not push him away. "Only for those who know how to behave," she replied, and her voice was light, but there was tension in it. "So behave yourself, Steve." "Decent," laughed the one with the tail. "This is not about us, baby. You know why we are here." Jake felt his fists clench. He didn't understand what was happening, but the man's words, his tone, his look, it was all wrong. He wanted to barge in, to say something, but fear paralyzed him. What could he do? He was just a kid, 16 years old, against two grown men, and against his mother. He stepped back, trying not to make a sound, and went back into his room. He closed the door and leaned back against it, feeling his heart pound in his throat. The noise from downstairs continued, muffled voices, laughter, the clink of glasses. Jake put on his headphones and turned up the volume, but even that couldn't drown out his thoughts. He felt dirty, like he'd done something bad just by seeing it. Anger at his mother mixed with guilt he shouldn't have peeked, shouldn't have known. But now he knew, and the knowledge was like poison, slowly coursing through his veins. In the morning, Mom acted like nothing had happened. She was standing at the stove, frying eggs, humming. Jake went downstairs, trying not to look her in the eye. He felt like if he did, she would know he knew. And then what? He wasn't ready for this conversation. "Good morning, darling," she said, placing a plate in front of him. "Did you sleep well?" "Yeah," he muttered, picking at his eggs with his fork. His voice sounded foreign, and he hoped she wouldn't notice. "You're a little quiet today," she noted, sitting down opposite him with a mug of coffee. "Is everything okay?" Jake nodded, not looking up. He couldn't speak. He couldn't tell her that he'd seen her with those men, that he'd heard their words, that he'd felt like his world had fallen apart. Instead, he just ate, trying to swallow the lump in his throat along with the food. "I'll be late at work today," Mom said, sipping her coffee. "I'll have to stop by the office. There are some urgent edits there. Can you handle it alone?" "Yes," he answered, and his voice was so quiet that she looked at him with a little concern. "Really? If anything, call, and don't forget about your homework." "I won't forget," he muttered, getting up from the table. He grabbed his backpack and almost ran out of the house without looking back. At school, he was distracted, unable to focus on his lessons. His friend Mike noticed this and tried to get him to talk, but Jake brushed it off, saying he just hadn't gotten enough sleep. But the truth was, he couldn't stop thinking about his mom, about those men, about what happened when he slept. He felt like a traitor for not speaking up, but at the same time, he was angry at her for making him feel this way. That evening, when he got home, he decided he couldn't just sit and wait any longer. He had to do something, at least figure out what was going on. When his mother left again, this time saying she was going to meet a friend, Jake waited for her car to drive away and then checked her laptop. She hadn't locked it with a password, and he quickly found the folder with her messages. There were messages from Dan, from Steve, from a few other names he didn't recognize. He didn't read them, he didn't have the courage, but the names, the dates, the times of the messages spoke for themselves. This wasn't a one-off. It was a pattern. He closed the laptop, his hands shaking. Anger washed over him in waves, but something else was behind it: shame, fear, the feeling that he was losing something important, something he could never get back. He didn't know how to live with it, but he knew he couldn't tell anyone. Not his dad, not his friends, not even himself. It was a dirty secret, and it was a part of him now. That night he lay awake again, listening to the sounds of the house. He waited for his mother to leave again, or for someone to come, but everything was quiet. And in that silence he felt more alone than ever. Jake sat at his desk in his room, lit only by the dim light of his desk lamp. A light rain fell outside, the drops pattering softly against the glass, creating a rhythm that seemed to be the only living sound in the house. It was almost 9 o'clock, and his mother had left again, this time to what she called an evening yoga class. Jake didn't believe her. He had long since stopped believing her excuses, but every time she left, he felt something inside him tighten, as if someone were slowly wringing out his lungs. He twirled the pencil in his hands, looking at the blank sheet of paper he'd torn from his English notebook. His laptop was nearby, but writing on it felt too cold, too formal. The letter had to be real, he thought, something that would make his dad feel bad about himself. Jake didn't know where to start. He imagined his dad sitting in his Chicago apartment, surrounded by papers and laptops, busy with his important work. Maybe he wouldn't even read the letter. Maybe he'd think it was just childish nonsense. But Jake had to try. He couldn't keep it inside any longer. His fingers shook as he wrote the first words, "Dear Dad." The pencil felt heavy and the letters came out uneven, as if he were writing for the first time. He paused, reread the 2 words, and felt a lump in his throat. He hadn't called his dad Dad in a letter since he was about 7, but now it seemed the only right word. He continued writing, slowly, choosing his words carefully so that they would not give away too much, but at the same time say enough. "Dear Dad, I know you're busy, and you probably have a lot of things to do there, but I need to tell you something. I don't know how to explain it so you'll understand, but I'll try. Everything's weird here while you're gone. Mom, she's different. She often leaves at night, says she's going to work or to see her friends, but I don't think that's true. I saw something, Dad. Something bad. I don't want to say what it was because I'm scared and I don't know how to say it, but I think she's doing something she shouldn't. I don't know what to do. I'm mad at her, but at the same time I'm ashamed that I'm mad. She's Mom, but I can't stop thinking about it, and I'm scared. You always said I could tell you everything, but I don't know how to tell you. I just want you to know that something's wrong. Maybe you could come over, or at least call. I don't want you to think I'm making this up, but I'm not, Dad. Honestly. Please write or call me. I miss you. Your son, Jake." He read the letter 3 times, each time feeling his cheeks burn with a mixture of shame and relief. He hadn't written everything he hadn't written about Dan, about the men in the leather jacket and the ponytail, about their laughter and his mother's words. He couldn't. It was too much. But he hoped his dad would understand that this was serious, that this wasn't just the whims of a 12-year-old boy. Jake folded the paper carefully, tucked it into an envelope, and wrote the address. Thomas Wilson, Chicago, Illinois. He knew his dad was renting an apartment somewhere downtown, but he didn't have the exact address. He decided he'd check with his mom in the morning, pretending it was just a letter with news. The thought of his mom asking what was in the letter made his mouth go dry, but he pushed the fear aside. He had to do this. He hid the envelope under his math book and went to bed, but he couldn't sleep. He imagined his dad opening the letter, frowning as he read the words, maybe calling his mom and asking what was going on. What if he didn't believe it? What if he thought Jake had made it all up? That was the worst thought of all, because then he'd be all alone with his secret. In Chicago, in a cramped rented apartment overlooking gray skyscrapers, Thomas sat at a kitchen table littered with printouts and a laptop. It was after midnight, but he was still working, reviewing reports for the next day's presentation. His glasses had slipped down his nose, and his tie was thrown casually over the back of his chair. The apartment was impersonal, a typical temporary base for business travelers. White walls, standard furniture, the smell of coffee and paper. He felt out of place there, but he tried not to think about it. The work was important, he told himself. It was for the family, for Jake, for Rachel. The letter arrived 3 days later in a nondescript white envelope with neat, childish handwriting. Thomas frowned when he saw it among the bills and brochures. He hadn't expected letters from Jake. His son usually wrote short messages on Messenger if he wrote at all. He opened the envelope, feeling slightly uneasy, and began to read. His brow furrowed with each word. He read the letter twice, trying to figure out what his son was trying to say. Mom is doing something bad. What could that mean? Rachel had always been the picture of organization, a woman who had everything under control. She had never given him any reason to doubt her. But Jake's words, so simple and sincere, touched something in him. He felt a twinge of alarm in his chest, but he quickly brushed it aside. This was probably a misunderstanding. Maybe Jake was just bored, exaggerating. Children sometimes saw things that weren't there. He put the letter down and picked up his phone to call Rachel, but he paused. What would he say? Jake wrote that you were doing something bad. It sounded ridiculous. He imagined her face, her smile, her calm voice that always explained everything. No, he wouldn't call. Not now. He decided he would talk to Jake and try to find out more. He dialed his son's number, but he didn't answer. He was probably already asleep. Thomas left a voicemail, trying to sound warm and confident. Hey, champ, got your letter. Thanks for writing. Let's talk tomorrow, okay? I miss you. Good night. He put the phone down and picked up the letter again, rereading the words. I'm scared, Jake had written. That was the word that cut him the hardest. His son, his boy, was scared, and Thomas wasn't there to fix it. He felt a pang of guilt for leaving, for being too busy, for maybe not noticing something important. But the idea that Rachel could do something bad seemed impossible. She was his wife, the mother of his son, the woman who had always held their family together. Or was she? He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city at night. The lights of the skyscrapers twinkled like stars, but they didn't give him answers. He decided he'd call Rachel in the morning, just to check in. Nothing accusatory, nothing harsh, just a conversation. But somewhere deep down, he knew that this conversation could change everything. The next day, Jake woke up with a heavy head. He had barely slept, thinking about the letter, wondering if it had arrived, if his dad had read it. When he saw the missed call and the voicemail, his heart jumped. He listened to the message, and his dad's voice, so familiar and warm, made him feel better for a second. But only for a second, because then he realized that his dad would want to talk, would want to know more, and Jake wasn't sure he was ready to tell. He went down to the kitchen, where his mother was already making breakfast avocado toast, his favorite. She smiled as if nothing had changed, as if she hadn't gone out at night, hadn't brought strange men into their home. Good morning, dear, she said, placing the plate in front of him. You're up early today. Yeah, Jake muttered, avoiding her gaze. He felt the anger rising in him again, but now there was something else mixed in with it, despair. He wanted to ask her why she was doing this, who these people were, but the words stuck in his throat. Did Dad call? She asked suddenly, and her voice was so casual that Jake flinched. No, he lied, too quickly. She looked at him, and for a second he thought she knew. But then she just nodded and went back to her coffee. Jake ate in silence, thinking about the letter, about his dad, about what would happen next. He didn't know how long he could keep quiet, but he knew the truth he was hiding was getting heavier. And sooner or later it would spill out like water from a cracked dam. Thomas stood at the window of his Chicago apartment, looking out at the gray city engulfed in the morning fog. Jake's letter, wrinkled from so many times he'd read it, lay on the table next to his cold coffee. His son's words, Mom is doing something bad, "I'm scared" played in his head like a broken record. He tried to brush them off, to tell himself that they were just teenage fantasies, that Jake, now 16, was simply worried about his long absence. But something about them stuck, like a hook he couldn't pull out. He knew his son. Jake wouldn't write something like that for no reason. Thomas picked up his phone and booked the next flight to Columbus. He didn't tell Rachel he didn't want her to prepare, to clean up her mess, to put on her perfect smile. If something was really going on, he needed to see it for himself. He packed his suitcase, throwing in only the essentials, and 3 hours later he was sitting on the plane, staring out the window at the clouds blurring into a white haze. His mind was just as clouded. He didn't know what to expect, but he had a feeling that coming home would be different than before. Jake sat in the backyard, idly bouncing a basketball across the asphalt. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the house seemed empty. Though his mom was somewhere inside, he could hear her on the phone, her voice muffled, but with the same playful lilt that now made him feel sick. He'd been living in a fog for the past few weeks, floating between anger, shame, and fear. Writing his dad a letter had been his last-ditch effort to snap out of it, but now that he knew his dad had received it, he felt even worse. What if he'd screwed it up? What if his dad didn't believe him? Or worse, if he did and everything fell apart. He heard the sound of a car pulling up and looked up. A yellow cab pulled up in front of the house, and his father got out. Jake froze, the ball falling from his hands and rolling down the driveway. Thomas looked tired, his suit slightly wrinkled, and there were shadows under his eyes that weren't there before. But he smiled when he saw his son, and the smile was so familiar, so dear, that Jake felt his throat tighten. "Hey, champ," Thomas said, putting his suitcase down and opening his arms. "Didn't expect me, huh?" Jake took a hesitant step forward, then rushed toward his father, hugging him tighter than he had in a long time. He was taller than he had been the last time, almost as tall as Thomas, but in that moment he felt like a little boy again. "Dad, you're back," he mumbled into his father's shoulder. His voice was shaking, and he hated himself for it. "Yes, I decided to make it a surprise," Thomas replied, patting him on the back. His gaze slid around the house, and a shadow of something sharp, almost predatory, flashed in it. "Where's Mom?" "Inside," Jake said, pulling away. He wanted to say more, but the words stuck. Instead, he just looked at his father, trying to figure out if he knew, if he suspected. Thomas nodded and headed toward the house, Jake following behind, his heart pounding. The living room smelled of lemony cleanser his mother had probably been cleaning that morning. Rachel came out of the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel, and froze when she saw Thomas. Her face twitched for a split second, but then she smiled that warm, practiced smile that Jake now hated. "Tom," she exclaimed, throwing the towel on the sofa and walking up to him. "Why didn't you warn me? I could have at least cooked a normal dinner." She hugged him, and Thomas hugged her back, but his movements were restrained, almost mechanical. Jake noticed, and his stomach clenched. Dad knew, or at least suspected. "I wanted to surprise you," Thomas said, stepping back and looking into her eyes. "Did it work?" "Oh yeah," Rachel said, her voice light, but Jake could hear the slight tremor in it. She turned to him. "Jake, did you know Dad was coming?" "No," he answered quickly, looking down. He felt like he was caught between two fires, not knowing whose side he was on. Thomas glanced at his son, then back at Rachel. "I'm hungry from the journey. Maybe we could order something? Pizza, like old times?" "Great idea," Rachel nodded, taking out her phone. "Pepperoni, like always?" "Yeah," Thomas said, but his eyes never left hers, as if he was looking for something in her movements, in her smile. The evening passed in a strange, almost theatrical atmosphere. They sat in the living room, eating pizza, and Rachel chatted about small things work, the neighbors, how Jake had forgotten to turn in a biology project. Thomas nodded, smiled, asked questions, but Jake could see that he was playing. His father, always so direct, was now like a chess player making moves without revealing his strategy. Jake felt complicit, though he didn't know why. As Rachel went into the kitchen to get drinks, Thomas turned to Jake and said quietly, "Let's go to the porch and chat." Jake nodded, his palms growing sweaty. They stepped outside, where the evening air was cool and the stars were just beginning to appear in the dark sky. Thomas sat down on the swing, which creaked under his weight, and patted the space next to him. "I got your letter," he began, looking off into the distance. "And I want you to tell me everything. No holds back. I won't be angry, Jake. Just tell me what you saw." Jake swallowed, his fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of his shirt. He didn't know where to begin, but the words he'd been holding in for so long suddenly came pouring out. "I saw Mom with some guy in the kitchen. They were kissing, and she talked to him in a way she never talked to you. His name was Dan. And then, at night, I saw others. Two. They were in the house, drinking wine, laughing. One of them was touching her, and she didn't push him away. Dad, I don't know what it is, but I'm scared. She leaves at night, thinking I'm asleep, but I hear everything." His voice broke, and he fell silent, tears burning his eyes. He hated himself for this, for not being stronger, for betraying his mother. But he couldn't stay silent any longer. Thomas listened without interrupting, his face unmoving, but Jake could see his jaw tighten, his fingers tightening on the edge of the swing. When Jake finished, Thomas was silent for a long moment, looking out at the dark street. Finally, he turned to his son and put his hand on his shoulder. "Thank you for telling me," he said quietly. "That was brave. I'll handle this, Jake. But you have to promise me. Act normal. Don't tell Mom I know. Don't tell anyone. Got it?" Jake nodded, feeling the weight on his heart ease a little. Dad believed. Dad was here. But at the same time, he felt like this was just the beginning of something bigger, something that could destroy everything. "What will you do?" he asked, almost in a whisper. Thomas looked at him, and there was a mixture of pain and determination in his eyes. "What I must," he replied. "But first I need to know more." Over the next few days, Thomas acted as if nothing had changed. He got up in the morning, made coffee, joked with Rachel over breakfast, helped Jake with his homework. But Jake could see his father watching. It was in the little things, the way he'd linger on Rachel's phone when she'd left it on the table, the way he'd listen to her calls while pretending to be busy with something else, the way he'd ask innocent questions about her day, her plans, her meetings with her friends. Rachel didn't seem to notice her smile was just as perfect, her voice just as light. But Jake knew his father saw more than she thought. One night, when Rachel said she was going to a work party, Thomas waited until she left and then checked her laptop. Jake, who hadn't slept, came downstairs and caught his father in the act. Thomas didn't flinch or try to hide what he was doing. He simply looked at his son and nodded as if to say, "You're in." "What are you looking for?" Jake whispered, coming closer. "Answers," Thomas said shortly, his fingers running quickly across the keyboard. He opened the messenger, scrolled through the messages, and Jake saw names: Dan, Steve, a few more he didn't recognize. The messages were short, but their tone was too personal, too close. Thomas copied them silently, emailed them to himself, took screenshots. His face was calm, but Jake could see the veins in his neck tense. "Dad, are you going to tell her?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. Thomas closed the laptop and turned to face him. "Not now," he said. "I don't want her to know that we know. Not until I'm ready." "Ready for what?" Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Thomas didn't answer right away. He stood up, walked over to the window, and looked out at the empty driveway where Rachel's car had been parked. "To make things right," he said finally. But there was no conviction in his voice, only a cold, controlled fury. Jake looked at his father and knew he had changed. This was no longer the dad who had gone to Chicago promising to call every night. This was a man preparing for war, and Jake, without wanting to, was his ally. He didn't know what would happen next, but he sensed that their family, their picture-perfect home, would never be the same. Thomas woke up early, when the sky outside was still gray and the house was drowning in the pre-dawn silence. He lay in bed, looking at Rachel sleeping. Her face, illuminated by the soft light of the alarm clock, seemed so familiar, so close, that for a second he almost forgot about Jake's letter, about his suspicions, about the screenshots of messages he had saved on his laptop. But only for a second. Reality returned like a cold wind, penetrating to the bone. He knew that he could no longer rely on intuition or random evidence. If he wanted the truth, he needed to act systematically, cold-bloodedly, like in his work, where every step was calculated and every mistake could cost dearly. He stood quietly, trying not to wake Rachel, and went down to the living room. There, on the coffee table, was a box that had been delivered yesterday as a package of office supplies. Inside were 3 small cameras, compact, Wi-Fi enabled, capable of recording high-definition video even in the dark. He'd ordered them after talking to a lawyer he'd found through an old friend from college. Edward Crow, a family lawyer, was straightforward and businesslike. If you want a divorce with evidence of infidelity, you need facts. Not rumors, not suspicions, videos, photos, correspondence. And do it legally, Tom. No illegal wiretaps, no hacking. Otherwise, it will come back to haunt you. Thomas nodded to himself, remembering that conversation. He wasn't sure if he wanted a divorce, but he knew he had to be prepared. He couldn't let his emotions get the better of him, not when not only his life was on the line, but Jake's too. His son, a 16-year-old boy who had seen too much already, deserved the truth, and Thomas was going to get it. He started in the kitchen. The camera, no bigger than a matchbox, was easily hidden behind a decorative vase on the shelf above the sink. Its lens was pointed at the countertop, where he'd seen Rachel with the man, Dan, the day Jake told him the truth. A second camera went into the living room, camouflaged among the books on the bookshelf, overlooking the couch and the front door. A third he set up in the upstairs hallway, tucked into a corner where the ceiling molding cast a small shadow. He worked quickly but carefully, checking the app on his phone to make sure the cameras were connected and transmitting. Each move was precise, as if he were assembling a complex mechanism where a mistake could ruin everything. By the time he finished, the sun was rising, bathing the house in golden light. Rachel came downstairs, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail, her phone in her hand. She smiled when she saw Thomas at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, her smile as perfect as ever. "You're early today," she said, pouring herself some coffee. "Did something happen?" Thomas shrugged, trying to sound casual. "Just couldn't sleep. I think I need to go to the office in Cincinnati for a couple of days. There's some problems with the project. They want me to check it out myself." Rachel nodded, her gaze flicking over him, but she said nothing. She just sipped her coffee and looked out the window, where the neighbor's dog was barking at a passing car. "When are you leaving?" she asked, and there was no surprise or concern in her voice, only a slight curiosity. "Tomorrow morning," Thomas replied. "I'll be back Wednesday. Can you handle Jake?" "Of course," she said, smiling a little wider. "We've gotten used to him. He's become a bit quiet, though. Teenagers, you know." Thomas nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He stared at her, trying to see behind her smile the woman Jake had described, the one who brought strange men into their home. But she looked the same as always, caring, organized, perfect, and that was what scared him most. The next day, Thomas left, but not for Cincinnati. He checked into a motel 20 minutes away, a cheap one with peeling walls and the smell of old carpet. From there, he could monitor the cameras on an app without attracting attention. He told Jake the truth, or at least part of the truth. The night before he left, he pulled his son aside while Rachel was in the shower and said quietly, "I'm going away for a couple of days, but it's not what you think. I installed cameras in the house. If anything happens, I'll see it. You just act normal, okay? And don't tell anyone." Jake looked at him, his eyes wide, relief and fear mixed in. "You really? Cameras? Is that legal?" "Yes," Thomas said, though he wasn't entirely sure. Edward had said that it wasn't illegal to have cameras in your own home, as long as they didn't record sound without consent. Thomas turned off the microphones to be on the safe side. "Just trust me, son. I'll figure it out." Jake nodded, but his face was tense. He looked older than his 16 years, as if the truth he was carrying had added years to his age. Thomas felt a pang of guilt, but pushed it aside. He was doing this for Jake, for their family, for understanding what was happening. The first night at the motel was long. Thomas sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the screen of his laptop, where the live feed from the cameras was playing. The house was quiet. Jake was in his room, staring at his phone. Rachel was cooking dinner, humming under her breath. She looked so ordinary, so normal, that Thomas began to doubt himself. Maybe Jake was wrong. Maybe he had imagined a monster where there was none. But on the second night, everything changed. Around midnight, when Jake was apparently asleep, judging by the camera in the hallway, Rachel came downstairs. She was not dressed as usual, not her usual sweater and jeans, but a tight black dress that Thomas had never seen before. Her hair was loose, and there was a slight smile on her lips, as if she was anticipating something. She opened the front door, and a man walked into the house. Thomas recognized him immediately. Dan, the one Jake had mentioned. Tall, in a denim jacket, with dark hair, slightly disheveled, as if he had just gotten out of a car after a long drive. Thomas felt his fingers curl into fists. He watched as Dan wrapped his arms around Rachel, his hands sliding down her back, her head thrown back as she laughed. They walked into the living room, and the camera on the bookshelf captured everything. Dan pulling her close, their lips meeting, her fingers tangling in his hair. It wasn't just a kiss, it was something hungry, almost animalistic, like they couldn't get enough of each other. Thomas forced himself to watch, even though every frame cut him like a knife. Half an hour later, another man came into the house, the same Steve Jake had described as blonde and with an accent. He was wearing the same leather jacket, and his movements were sharp, almost defiant. He joined them in the living room, and Thomas watched Rachel laugh, her hands brushing against each other, drinking wine from glasses she'd pulled out of the cabinet. The camera didn't record sound, but Thomas could imagine their voices, their laughter, their words. He felt the anger rising in him, but he forced himself to sit still, writing down the time, saving the video, and taking screenshots. By morning, he had enough material. Hours of video, dozens of screenshots, time codes of every moment Rachel touched these men, every moment they touched her. He sent it all to Edward with a short message. "This is what you asked for. What's next?" An hour later, he responded, "Good work. Come see me tomorrow. We need to discuss strategy." Thomas came home on Wednesday, as he had promised. He walked into the house with his suitcase as if nothing had changed and hugged Rachel, who greeted him with a smile and the smell of freshly baked pie. She looked the same as always, but Thomas saw her differently now. Every movement, every look in her eyes seemed to him part of a mask she wore with such ease that it was frightening. "How was your trip?" she asked, placing a plate of dinner in front of him. "As usual," he replied, shrugging. "Lots of paperwork, lots of meetings. Missed home." She smiled, but her gaze slid past him, as if checking to see if he was staring too hard. Jake was sitting at the table, picking at his food, and Thomas saw his son glance at him, looking for reassurance that he had everything under control. Thomas nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, and Jake looked down, but his shoulders relaxed. After dinner, Thomas went to his office under the pretext of work. He connected to the cameras, checked that they were still working, and transferred all the recordings to an encrypted external drive. He knew he had to be careful. Rachel was smart, and if she suspected he knew anything, she might destroy the evidence or make up an explanation. He couldn't let that happen. The next day, he went to see Edward. The lawyer's office was in downtown Columbus, in an old building with tall windows and the smell of polished wood. Edward, a short man with a bald head and sharp eyes, looked at the videos and screenshots without showing any emotion. "That's strong evidence," he said, leaning back in his chair. "In Ohio, adultery doesn't factor into divorces as much as it used to, but it could help with property division and custody of Jake. Are you sure you want to go through with it?" Thomas was silent, looking at his hands. He didn't know what he wanted: divorce, revenge, or just the truth. He thought about Jake, the way his son looked at him, his letter, his fear. He thought about Rachel, the woman he loved who now seemed like a stranger. "I want her to know that I know," he said finally. "But not now. I want to be prepared. What do I do next?" Edward nodded, as if he expected this answer. "Keep gathering evidence. Another couple of weeks to make sure this isn't a one-off. Check her phone if you can, but without hacking it, that's illegal. If she leaves it without the password, make copies of the messages, and keep Jake out of it. He's having a hard enough time as it is." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight on his shoulders grow even heavier. He knew this was just the beginning, that the truth he was seeking could destroy everything he had. But he couldn't stop. Not now that he had seen what was happening behind the closed doors of their perfect home. At home, he continued to play his role: loving husband, caring father. He joked with Rachel, helped Jake with his homework, and fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom. But every night, when the house went to sleep, he checked the cameras, saved new footage, and looked for new evidence. Rachel continued to leave at night, and each time she returned, her smile was a little brighter, her voice a little lighter, as if she had lifted some weight. But Thomas knew that weight was now on him and on Jake. One night, after Rachel was gone again, Thomas called Jake into his room. He showed him one of the screenshots, not the most explicit, just a moment of Rachel hugging Dan in the living room. Jake stared at the screen, his face pale. "Are you going to tell her?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Not yet," Thomas replied. "But I want you to know that I can handle this. You're not alone, Jake." Jake nodded, but his eyes were full of pain. He went to his room, and Thomas sat there, staring at the screen. He knew that the truth he was piecing together like a puzzle would soon come together, and when it did, he would be ready. Not for revenge, as he had previously thought, but to protect his son and perhaps himself. Evening had fallen like a soft blanket over the Columbus suburb, blanketing the streets in warm streetlights and the smell of freshly cut grass. The Wilsons' house, with its white exterior and neat lawn, looked like a postcard, but inside the air was heavy, thick with unspoken words and a tension you could almost feel. Thomas was in his office, scrolling through the security footage on his laptop, when he heard Jake's footsteps on the stairs. He quickly closed the app, not wanting his son to see the footage again. It had already caused too much pain. Jake walked into the room without knocking, his thin shoulders tense and his eyes darting from corner to corner, as if he were searching for something to hold on to. At 16, he looked older not because of his height or the light stubble on his chin, but because of the shadows in his eyes that had developed over the past few weeks. Thomas put his laptop down and turned to face his son, trying not to let the storm raging inside show on his face. "Hey," he said softly, patting the couch next to him. "Sit down. Is something wrong?" Jake hesitated, shifting from one foot to the other, then plopped down on the couch, so hard the springs creaked. He looked at the floor, fiddling with a lace of his sneakers, and Thomas noticed his fingers shaking, just barely, but enough to make his heart clench. Jake began, but his voice broke. He cleared his throat, as if trying to clear away the weakness. "I don't know how to live with this, Dad. With what I saw. With what Mom does. I think about it all the time, and it makes me sick." Thomas felt his own breathing become heavier. He knew Jake was suffering, but hearing it out loud, seeing his son, usually so reserved, almost break, was too much to bear. He moved closer, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder, and felt Jake tense up, but he didn't pull away. "Listen to me," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice firm but warm. "What you're feeling is okay. You saw something you weren't supposed to see, and it's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong, Jake. Understand, this isn't you, this is—" He paused, choosing his words so as not to say too much, to not betray his anger. "This is adult stuff, and I'll handle it, but you need to trust me." Jake looked up, his eyes dark as his mother's, filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "You're really going to figure this out? I mean, what are you going to do?" Are you going to tell her? Or, he hesitated, as if afraid to say the word divorce. Thomas took a deep breath, trying to balance the truth with what his son could handle. I don't know what I'm going to do yet, he admitted. But I promise I'll make it all better. Not like it was before, I can't promise that. But I'll make it so you don't have to feel like this anymore. So you don't have to be afraid. Jake nodded, but his lips were trembling, and Thomas knew his son was fighting back tears. He hadn't seen Jake cry since he was a baby, and the sight cut him like a blade. He squeezed his son's shoulder a little harder, keeping him from retreating into himself. You're not alone, Thomas continued, his voice quieter but firmer. I'm here, and I'm not leaving. We'll get through this together, but I need you to do one thing. One very important one. Jake looked at him, his eyebrows raising slightly. What? Don't tell anyone, Thomas said, looking him straight in the eye. Not Mom, not our friends, not even Mike. No one. If Mom finds out, we know she might. He hesitated, not wanting to scare his son any more. She might make it worse. I have to make sure I have what it takes to handle this right. Do you understand? Jake swallowed, his fingers stopping fiddling with the cord. Yeah, I know. I won't tell. I promise. Well done, Thomas said, a small smile creeping into his voice, though inside he felt rage and pain vying for supremacy. You're stronger than you think, Jake. I'm proud of you. Jake lowered his head, but the corners of his lips twitched, as if he wanted to smile but couldn't bring himself to. I want things to be like before, he muttered, when we were all together and there wasn't this. Thomas nodded, even though he knew the past was gone. He remembered the nights he and Rachel and Jake had sat in the living room, watching old movies, eating popcorn, laughing at stupid jokes. Everything had seemed simple then, real. But now he saw cracks that maybe had always been there, he just hadn't wanted to see them. I know, son, he said quietly, and I'll do everything I can to make sure you have a normal life. Maybe not like before, but a normal life, where you don't have to be afraid or feel guilty. Jake looked at him, and there was something new in his gaze, not just fear or pain, but a spark of trust. He nodded, and this time his shoulders relaxed, as if the heavy weight he was carrying had become a little lighter. Come on, Thomas said, standing up. Let's order some Chinese and watch something, just like old times. Jake smiled for the first time in a long time, and it was like a ray of light in a dark room. Just without your stupid 80s comedies, okay? Thomas laughed, the first real laugh he'd heard in days. Not a chance, kid. The Breakfast Club is a classic. They were sitting in the living room, watching John Hughes tell his story about teenagers who find each other in the school library. The noodle boxes smelled of soy sauce and ginger, and for a while, everything did seem almost normal. Rachel was upstairs, showering, and her absence gave her and Jake a rare moment where they could just be father and son without the shadow of what was going on behind closed doors. But Thomas couldn't relax completely. He knew the cameras were still rolling, recording Rachel's every move, every look, every moment she thought no one was watching. He knew the external drive already had enough evidence to destroy their marriage, but he wasn't ready to pull the trigger. Not yet. He wanted to make sure he was doing this right, not just for himself, but for Jake as well. When the movie ended, Jake reached for another serving of noodles, but stopped and looked at his father. Dad, what if? What if she finds out? What then? Thomas put his box down and turned to his son. If she finds out, we'll get through this. Together. But I'll make sure it doesn't happen until we're ready. Just hang in there, okay? And remember, I'm here for you. Jake nodded, and there was something in his eyes that Thomas hadn't seen before, not just trust, but determination. As if, despite his fear, he was willing to stand by his father's side no matter what. I'm holding on, Jake said, his voice firmer than before. Just, don't let her hurt me. Please. Thomas felt his heart tighten. He reached out and ruffled his son's hair, like he had when he was younger. Never, he said. I'll never let you get hurt. I promise. Later, after Jake had gone to bed, Thomas stayed in the living room, staring at the dark TV screen. He pulled out his phone and checked the camera app. Nothing new. Rachel was in the bedroom, reading a book, her face calm, as if she carried no secrets. But Thomas knew the truth. He'd seen her with Dan, with Steve, seen her laugh, her hands touching theirs, her eyes sparkling with something he hadn't seen in years. He opened his laptop and texted Edward, "One more week. I want to make sure I have everything." The answer came almost immediately, "Okay, but don't take too long. The longer you wait, the harder it will be." Thomas nodded to himself, closed his laptop, and went upstairs. He lay down next to Rachel, feeling her warm breath on his shoulder, and closed his eyes, pretending to sleep. But in his head, he was going over the plan, step by step, like an engineer building a bridge across a chasm. He didn't know what was waiting on the other end, but he knew he had to get there for Jake, for himself, for the truth that could no longer remain in the shadows. Thomas stood in the living room, his suitcase already packed and waiting by the door, neatly labeled with an airline tag, a reminder of his recent business trips. But this time, he wasn't going to Chicago. He was going away for good. The last few weeks had been like a chess game, where every move was calculated and every mistake could cost him everything. The cameras in the house had recorded enough. Hours of video of Rachel meeting with Dan, with Steve, with other men whose faces Thomas now knew better than he wanted to. He had turned it over to Edward, his lawyer, who had assured him that the evidence was ironclad. In Ohio, adultery was not a major factor in a divorce, but it could affect the division of property and, more importantly, custody of Jake. Thomas did not want a war, but he was prepared for one if Rachel decided to fight. He was waiting for her in the living room, sitting on the couch where they once watched family movies. His fingers tapped against his knee, the only sign of nervousness he allowed himself. Jake was upstairs in his room, and Thomas had asked him not to come down until he called. This was a conversation he needed to have alone. Rachel walked into the house around 8, her steps light as if she had just returned from another meeting with her friends. She dropped her bag on a chair in the hallway and walked into the living room, her smile as perfect as ever, but Thomas noticed a hint of weariness in her eyes. "Tom, are you still awake?" she said, taking off her coat and hanging it over the back of a chair. "I thought you were going to bed early today. You said you were tired." Thomas stood up, his movements slow, almost theatrical. He looked at her, and in that moment all his rage, all the pain he had been holding in for weeks, threatened to burst forth. But he forced himself to speak calmly, his voice as smooth as the surface of a frozen lake. "I've filed for divorce, Rachel," he said, looking her straight in the eyes. Her smile faltered, as if someone had turned off the light in her face. She froze, her fingers still clutching the edge of her coat, clenching. "What?" she asked, her voice quiet but already laced with alarm. "Tom, what are you talking about? Is this a joke?" "No jokes," he replied, crossing his arms over his chest. "I filed the paperwork this morning. My lawyer has already prepared everything." Rachel stepped toward him, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and anger. "Why? Tom, what's going on? You can't just file for divorce. Explain." Thomas took a deep breath, his heart pounding. He wanted to throw everything in her face. The names of her lovers, the videos, the screenshots, Jake's words. But he remembered Edward's advice. Don't give her any leverage. Don't say anything that could be used against you. He straightened up, his gaze growing colder. "You'll find out everything at the trial," he said. "I don't want to discuss it now." Rachel looked at him, her lips trembling as if she was trying to find the words that would stop him. "Tom, this is crazy. You can't just leave without explaining. What did I do? Tell me what I did." Her voice broke on a high note, and Thomas felt his resolve waver. He had known this woman for nearly 20 years, loved her, built a family with her, watched her hold Jake when he was a baby. But here was a different Rachel, now one who had lied, one who had brought strange men into their home, one who had made their son afraid. He shook his head. "I said you'll find out everything at the trial," he repeated, turning to his suitcase. "I'm leaving. Today." Rachel took a step toward him, her hand gripping his elbow, but he pulled away gently but firmly. "Tom, please," she said, and there was something like panic in her voice now. "Let's talk. We can fix this. For Jake." The mention of his son was like a punch to the gut. Thomas stopped, his fingers gripping the handle of his suitcase so tightly his knuckles turned white. He turned to her, and his gaze was so sharp that she involuntarily stepped back. "Don't talk about Jake," he said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "You've done enough for him already." She opened her mouth to speak, but he had already turned and headed for the stairs. "Jake," he called, his voice echoing through the house. "Come down." Rachel froze, her face pale. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You can't take him." Thomas didn't answer. He waited for Jake to come down, and a minute later his son appeared on the stairs, backpack over his shoulder and duffel bag in his hand. His face was tense, but there was a determination in his eyes that Thomas hadn't seen before. Jake looked at his mother, and for a second his gaze wavered, but he quickly turned away and walked over to his father. "Jake," Rachel said, her voice pleading. "Honey, stay. We can talk. It'll be okay." Jake shook his head, his fingers tightening on the strap of his backpack. "I don't want to stay, Mom," he said quietly but firmly. "I'm going with Dad." Rachel took a step toward him, but Thomas stepped between them, his hand on his son's shoulder. "Don't, Rachel," he said. "Don't make it harder." She looked at them, her eyes filled with tears, but Thomas wasn't sure if they were real or not. He no longer trusted her emotions, her words, her face. He turned to Jake and nodded toward the door. "Let's go." They walked out of the house without looking back. The taxi was already waiting in the driveway, and Thomas helped Jake throw his bag into the trunk. As they got in, Jake looked at his father, his face pale, but there was something new in it, relief. "Where are we going?" he asked as the taxi pulled away. "I rented an apartment," Thomas replied, looking out the window where the Wilsons' house was slowly disappearing from view. "Not far from the center. A good place. You'll like it." Jake nodded, but his eyes were on the road. Is she going to be okay?" he asked quietly, almost whispering. Thomas looked at his son, feeling his heart clench. Even after everything Jake had seen, he still cared about his mother. It hurt, but it also made him proud. "She'll be fine," he said, trying to sound confident. "And you and I will be fine. I promise." The apartment Thomas rented was in a new development in downtown Columbus, with large windows overlooking the Scioto River. It was small but modern, an open floor plan, a kitchen with granite countertops, a pair of bedrooms with minimalist furnishings. Thomas chose it for its convenient location and because it was the complete opposite of their old home. No memories, no shadows of the past. He and Jake walked inside, and Thomas noticed his son looking around as if trying to figure out if this would be home. He dropped his backpack on the couch and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "Better than okay," Thomas smiled, setting his suitcase against the wall. "There's a gym downstairs and a pizza place across the street, and I arranged for you to be transferred to a school closer. Everything will be fine, Jake." Jake nodded, but his eyes were distant. "What happens at the trial?" he asked, turning to his father. "You're really not going to tell her, you know." Thomas sat down on the couch, rubbing his temples. "Not now," he said. "Edward says it's best to keep this quiet until the hearing. If she finds out about the evidence, she might try to change things, make up excuses. I want this to be fair." Jake nodded, but his face was tense. I don't want to see her, Dad. Not now. Not after everything." "I understand," Thomas said, his voice soft but firm. "You don't have to. You'll be with me, and we'll figure this out together." Jake looked at his father, and there was something in his eyes that Thomas hadn't seen before, not just trust, but deep, almost desperate gratitude. He walked over to the couch and sat down next to him, saying nothing. They sat there for a few minutes, looking out at the lights of the city, and there was something healing in the silence, as if they could finally breathe freely. That night, Thomas lay in his new bedroom, staring at the ceiling. The apartment was quiet, too quiet after the creaking floorboards of their old house. He thought about Rachel, about her tears, about the way she looked at him when he left. He thought about Jake, about how his son had chosen him, despite the pain it had caused him. And he thought about the trial that lay ahead, about the evidence that lay on the encrypted drive, about a future that was so uncertain. He knew he had taken the first step, but the road ahead was long. He didn't want revenge, like he had once thought. He wanted justice for himself, for Jake, for the family they had once been. And he was willing to fight for it, one step at a time, until the truth was clear to everyone. The courtroom in downtown Columbus was cold and impersonal, with high ceilings and rows of wooden benches polished to a shine by 1,000 touches. Morning light streamed through narrow windows, casting long shadows on the floor, but the air was heavy, as if before a storm. Thomas sat in one of the front pews, his dark suit immaculately pressed, but the fingers clasped in his lap betrayed a slight tremor. Next to him, a little further back, sat Jake, his thin shoulders tense, his gaze darting around the room, avoiding the face of his mother, who sat stony-faced across the aisle. Rachel didn't look like her usual self. Her usual perfect smile was gone, replaced by a mask of composed calm. She was dressed in a sharp gray suit, her hair pulled back into a tight bun, but her eyes, usually so lively, now seemed dull. She wasn't looking at Thomas or Jake. Her gaze was fixed on the judge's table, as if she was trying to hold herself in the moment, not allowing her emotions to spill out. Her attorney, a middle-aged woman with sharp features, was whispering something in her ear, but Rachel just nodded slightly, her eyes fixed on the empty space in front of her. Thomas could feel his heart pounding, but he remained calm on the surface. Edward Crow, his lawyer, sat next to him, leafing through a folder of papers, his expression focused but confident. He and Thomas had prepared everything over the past weeks: security footage, screenshots of text messages, time codes, accounts from neighbors who had seen strangers' cars outside their house at late hours. Edward was methodical, almost surgically precise, and Thomas trusted him, but he still felt a tremor building inside him. This wasn't just a trial, this was the moment when their entire lives, their entire family, would be taken apart, dismantled, like a machine that could never be put back together. The judge, an older man with gray hair and a tired look, entered the courtroom and everyone stood up. His robe rustled as he sat down, and his voice, dry and businesslike, cut through the silence. "The case is Wilson v. Wilson," he announced, adjusting his glasses. "I asked the counsel to present their positions." Edward stood up first, his posture straight and his voice confident, as if he already knew the outcome. "Your Honor, my client, Thomas Wilson, has filed for divorce on the grounds of irreconcilable differences and emotional distress caused to both himself and their minor son, Jake Wilson, by the actions of the defendant, Rachel Wilson. We have evidence of the defendant's inappropriate behavior, including adultery, as well as her impact on the child's psychological well-being. We ask the court to consider these facts when considering custody and property division." Rachel's attorney, Miss Lawrence, stood up, her voice sharp, almost defiant. "Your Honor, my client denies the allegations of improper conduct. She claims that the marriage broke down because of Mr. Wilson's long absences and neglect. We ask the court to dismiss the unfounded allegations and to consider the custody issue in the best interests of the child, who we believe should remain with her mother." The judge nodded, his face unreadable. "Go on, Mr. Crow. What evidence are you prepared to present?" Thomas felt his palms grow sweaty. He glanced at Jake, who sat with his head down, his fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of his sleeve. Thomas knew his son didn't want to be here, didn't want to see their family torn apart, but he insisted that Jake be there. Not to hurt him, but to let him know that the truth was coming out, and he wasn't alone. Edward walked up to the evidence table, holding a portable drive and a folder of printouts. "Your Honor, We have video recordings taken inside the Wilson family home with the consent of my client, who is the owner of the property. These recordings show multiple instances of the defendant, Rachel Wilson, bringing strange men into the family home at night in the presence of her minor son. We also provide screenshots of text messages confirming her connections to these individuals, as well as statements from neighbors that corroborate the suspicious activity. The court went silent, and Thomas heard Rachel inhale sharply. She turned to face her lawyer, her face pale, but Miss Lawrence merely placed a hand on her shoulder, whispering something that made Rachel sit up straighter. The judge nodded, accepting the disc and folder from Edward. "We'll look at that evidence," he said, "but I want to hear how it relates to the child's moral harm." Edward turned to Jake, his gaze softening. "Your Honor, with your permission, I would like to call Jake Wilson to the stand. His testimony is critical to understanding the impact of the defendant's actions on his psychological state." Thomas felt his heart clench. He didn't want Jake to go through this, but Edward insisted. His son's testimony would be key. Rachel turned to Jake, her eyes full of pain, but he didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the floor. The judge nodded, and Jake rose slowly, his movements awkward as if he were trying to hold himself together in the moment. He took his place on the witness stand, his hands clenched into fists, and Thomas noticed his son struggling to breathe evenly. "Jake," Edward began, his voice soft but professional, "tell the court what you've seen in your home in recent months." Jake swallowed, his gaze darting from his father to the judge. He spoke quietly, but his voice was clear despite the tremors. I saw my mother bringing men home. At night, when she thought I was asleep. Once, I saw her with a guy named Dan. They were kissing in the kitchen, and then there were others. Too. They were drinking wine and laughing and touching her. I heard them talking, and it was wrong. I didn't know what to do. I was scared." A hushed murmur filled the room, and Thomas saw Rachel close her eyes, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Miss Lawrence leaned toward her, but Rachel shook her head, her face white as paper. "How did this affect you, Jake?" Edward asked, his voice full of sympathy. Jake hesitated, his gaze falling to his hands. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about it. I felt dirty, like it was my fault that I saw it. I was angry at her, but then I felt ashamed because she's my mom. I didn't want to hate her, but I couldn't live with it." Edward nodded, turning to the judge. "Your Honor, Jake's testimony establishes that the defendant's actions created a toxic environment in the home that caused serious emotional harm to the minor. We ask that this be taken into account when determining custody." The judge looked at Jake, his gaze gentle, almost fatherly. "Thank you, young man. You may return to your seat." Jake stepped down from the stand, his shoulders shaking but holding on. Thomas reached out, squeezing his hand as his son sat down next to him. "You did well," he whispered, and Jake nodded, his eyes wet but not crying. Edward then turned on the projector, and the footage from the cameras appeared on the screen. The room held its breath as the first video showed Rachel and Dan in the living room, hugging, kissing, her laughing. Then another shot of Steve and another man, their hands on her waist, her playful gaze. The videos were silent, but they spoke for themselves. Miss Lawrence tried to object, claiming the recordings were made without consent, but Edward quickly countered by producing documents proving that the cameras were installed in a house owned by Thomas, making them legal. Rachel sat still, her face a mask, but Thomas could see her hands shaking. She wasn't looking at the screen, her gaze fixed on the table, as if she were trying to disappear. When the video ended, the room was filled with a silence so heavy it seemed to weigh on everyone. The judge cleared his throat, his voice even but tired. "I will review all the evidence presented and make a decision within a week. The hearing is over." As they left the hall, Thomas could feel the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. Jake walked beside him, his face pale but with a new determination. They got into the car, and Thomas turned to his son. "You were brave," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I know how hard it was." Jake nodded, looking out the window. She didn't even look at me, he said quietly. It's like I don't exist to her. Thomas gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. It's her choice, Jake, not yours. You did what you had to, and I'm proud of you. Jake turned to him, his eyes shining, but he smiled, weakly but genuinely. Thanks, Dad. What now? Now we wait for a decision, Thomas said. But whatever happens, you and I are together, and that's the main thing. They drove to their new apartment, where the lights of the city reflected in the windows like the promise of a new beginning. Thomas knew that the trial was only part of the journey, that there was still much pain and questions to come. But he also knew that he and Jake could handle it. The truth had come out, and though it was bitter, it had set them both free. The morning in Columbus was damp and gray, the sky thick with clouds, and the air smelling of rain and wet leaves. The courtroom where the Wilson family drama had unfolded a week earlier was tense once again. The verdict was to be read today, and Thomas, sitting in the same bench as last time, felt his heart beating steadily but heavily, as if counting down the final seconds before the inevitable. Jake sat next to him, his skinny fingers fiddling with his watch band, his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't want to look at his mother, who sat across the aisle, her face pale, her eyes empty, as if she already knew she had lost. Rachel looked different than she had at the last hearing. Her formal suit had been replaced by a simple black dress, and her hair, usually neatly coiffed, now looked slightly tousled, as if she hadn't slept the night before. Her lawyer, Miss Lawrence, sat next to her, leafing through papers, but her movements were sharp, almost irritated, as if she knew her chances were slim. Thomas wasn't looking at them, his gaze fixed on the judge, who walked into the courtroom, his robes rustling like dry leaves. The judge, the same tired-looking older man, took his seat and opened the case file. His voice, when he spoke, was dry and businesslike, but there was a sense of the weight of the moment in it. In Wilson v. Wilson, he began, adjusting his glasses, the court has considered the evidence presented, including videotapes, correspondence, and witness statements, as well as the testimony of the minor Jake Wilson. Based on these materials, the court finds that the marriage between Thomas Wilson and Rachel Wilson is dissolved for irreconcilable differences and proven misconduct on the part of the defendant. Thomas felt his shoulders relax slightly, but he didn't let himself exhale. He waited for her to continue, knowing that the most important part was yet to come. As for the custody of the minor Jake Wilson, the judge continued, the court takes into account the psychological state of the child caused by the actions of the defendant, as well as his own desire to live with his father. Full custody is transferred to Thomas Wilson. Rachel Wilson is granted the right to supervised visits, but only with the consent of the child and under the supervision of an appointed social worker. The house registered in the name of Thomas Wilson remains in his ownership. The division of property will be carried out in accordance with the financial documents presented, but taking into account the moral damage caused to the plaintiff and the child. A hushed murmur filled the room, and Thomas heard Rachel gasp softly. He glanced at her, and their eyes met for the first time during the hearing. There was a mixture of despair and anger in her gaze, but he quickly looked away, not wanting to see her hurt. She had made her choice, he told himself. Now there were consequences. Miss Lawrence jumped to her feet, her voice sharp. Your Honor, my client requests the floor. She has a right to explain her actions. The judge looked at her over his glasses, his eyebrows rising slightly. Very well, Miss Lawrence, but I warn you that the decision has already been made. Mrs. Wilson, you may speak. Rachel rose slowly, her hands shaking as she leaned against the table. She looked at the judge, then at Thomas, and finally at Jake, who still avoided her gaze. Her voice, when she spoke, was hoarse, as if she were struggling with each word. I didn't mean for it to end this way, she began, her fingers tightening on the edge of the table. Tom, I know what you think of me, but it's not what it seems. I was alone. You were gone all the time, for months at a time, and I tried to cope. I didn't want Jake to see. I didn't want him to get hurt. I love him, and I love you, Tom. I made a mistake, but I'm not a monster. please give me a chance to make it right." Her voice broke, and she fell silent, her eyes filling with tears. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest, but he forced himself to remain still. He had heard those words before, not in court, but in those moments when he had tried to convince himself that she was still the woman he loved. But now he knew the truth, and her words rang hollow, like an echo in an empty house. Beside her, Jake tensed, his hands clenched into fists. He looked at his mother, and there was pain in his eyes, but not forgiveness. "You knew I was home," he said quietly, but his voice carried through the room like a gunshot. "You knew, and you still brought them. Don't tell me you didn't want me to get hurt." Rachel gasped, her hand reaching out to him, but he turned away, clinging to his father. The judge raised his hand for silence. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, his voice calm but firm, "your explanations do not change the facts as presented to the court. The decision stands. The hearing is over." Rachel sank into a chair, her face white as chalk. Miss Lawrence whispered something to her, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were blank, as if she had lost everything she had. Thomas stood, putting his hand on Jake's shoulder, and they walked out of the room without looking back. He could feel his son shaking but holding on, and it filled him with a strange mixture of pride and pain. It was drizzling outside, and he and Jake quickly got into the car. Thomas started the engine but stood there, watching the raindrops run down the windshield. Jake was silent, his eyes glued to his hands in his lap. "Are you okay?" Thomas asked, his voice soft but tired. Jake nodded, but his voice was hoarse. "I don't know how I feel, Dad. I thought I don't know, happy, but I'm just sad." She looked so broken. Thomas gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "I know, son, but she made a choice, and we made ours. Now we start over." Jake looked at him, his eyes wet, but he nodded. "What about the house? Are we going back there?" Thomas shook his head. He had thought about this before the trial, when he and Edward had discussed possible scenarios. The house that had once been their refuge now seemed like a cage full of ghosts from the past. He didn't want Jake to live in a place where every corner was a reminder of what they had lost. "I've decided to put it up for sale," he said. "We'll find something new, bigger, more modern, somewhere closer to the center so you can get to school more easily, maybe with a view of the river. Would you like that?" Jake smiled, weakly but sincerely. "Yeah, that sounds cool. Maybe there'll be room for a basketball hoop." Thomas laughed, the first laugh he'd heard in a long time that wasn't tinged with pain. "Of course, and maybe even for your stupid game console." "Hey, she's not stupid," Jake said, but there was a lightness in his voice that hadn't been there in a long time. That evening, they returned to their apartment, which now felt a little more like home than before. Thomas contacted a realtor to begin the process of selling the house. He could already picture himself and Jake choosing a new place, something spacious with big windows where they could start over. He knew that the money from selling the house would not only buy them a new place, but also give Jake a good future, college, travel, everything he deserved. Rachel called that night, her number popping up on Thomas's phone, but he didn't answer. She left a voicemail, her voice broken and full of tears. "Tom, please let me talk to Jake. I know what I've done, but I'm his mother. I want to make it right." Thomas listened to the message, but didn't call back. He showed it to Jake, and his son shook his head. "I'm not ready," he said. "Maybe someday, but not now." Thomas nodded, feeling pride for his son mingle with the pain of everything they had lost. "When you're ready, you decide," he said. "For now, we're with you, and that's enough." They sat on the couch, looking out at the city lights, and for the first time in a long time, Thomas felt like they were on the right path. The house they had left behind was full of shadows, but there was something new ahead of them, not perfect, but real, and he was ready to build it for Jake, for himself, for whatever life they could still create. Columbus was waking up slowly, the morning light filtering through a thin layer of clouds, painting the streets a soft golden color. Thomas and Jake's new house, located in a quiet neighborhood near the Scioto River, was a far cry from their old cottage. A modern two-story building with large picture windows and a minimalist design, it looked like something out of a magazine. Clean lines, glass railings, a spacious backyard with a basketball hoop, which Thomas had installed first. The interior smelled of fresh paint and new wood floors, and the furniture he and Jake had chosen with each passing day was comfortable without being overly fussy gray fabric couches, a wooden table, a few colorful throw pillows that Jake had insisted on adding for ambience. This was their new start, and Thomas felt like the house was becoming more theirs with each passing day. The move had been quick. The money from the sale of the old house had closed the deal in a couple of weeks, and Thomas and Jake had spent the weekend unpacking boxes and arguing over where to hang a poster of Jake's favorite basketball team. Now, a month after the trial, they were on the threshold of a new life, and Thomas, looking at his son tinkering with a box of books in the living room, felt like he'd made the right choice. But the shadow of the past still lingered in the background, haunting him in the quiet moments when he was alone with his thoughts. Jake, sitting on the floor among the scattered books, looked up at his father. "Dad, do you seriously think we need that shelf?" he asked, pointing to the massive bookcase they'd bought at a yard sale. "It's huge, like we're opening a library." Thomas smiled, leaning against the doorframe. "What, you want your textbooks lying around the house? It's called being organized, son. Get used to it." Jake rolled his eyes, but there was a lightness in his smile that hadn't been there a few months ago. He was still guarded, still withdrawn at times, but Thomas could see his son coming alive. The therapist Jake had started seeing once a week was helping him process what he'd been through. Dr. Linda Graham, a soft-spoken woman with a knack for asking questions that didn't sound like an interrogation, had become a safe space for Jake to talk about his anger, his guilt, the pain his mother had caused him. Thomas had insisted on these visits, despite Jake's initial resistance, and now he could see his son becoming a little more open, a little more like his old self. "Linda asked me how I was doing again today," Jake said, stacking his books. "She said I'm making progress. I don't know what that means, but I guess it's a good thing." Thomas came closer and squatted next to his son. "It means you're stronger than you think. I always knew that." Jake looked at him, his eyes serious, but there was none of the fear in them that Thomas had seen before. "Do you really think that? Sometimes I feel like like I messed everything up. If I hadn't written you that letter, maybe things would have been different." Thomas put his hand on his son's shoulder, his fingers firm but warm. "Listen to me, Jake. You didn't screw anything up. You did what you had to do. You told the truth, and that was brave. If you hadn't, we'd still be living that lie, and I don't want you to live that way, ever." Jake nodded, his lips twitching but keeping his emotions in check. I'm glad you're back, Dad, and that we're here, together." Thomas felt his throat tighten. He remembered those years when Jake was a baby running after him around the yard, building pillow forts, promising himself he'd do anything for his son. Back then, he'd thought anything meant providing for his family, giving Jake a good education, a home where he'd feel safe. But now he realized that anything meant more, protecting him from pain, from lies, from those who would destroy his world. And even if it meant tearing their family apart, he was willing to pay the price. "I'll always be with you," he said, his voice quiet but determined. "And I won't let anyone ruin what we have again. Anyone." Jake smiled, not widely but genuinely, and in that smile Thomas saw the trust he thought he had lost. He stood up, ruffling his son's hair, and went into the kitchen to make coffee. A new home, a new life, new rules. He was ready to build it, step by step, for Jake, for himself. Rachel, meanwhile, watched their lives from afar. She rented a small apartment on the other side of town, in an old building with peeling paint and creaking floors. Her life, once so orderly, was now chaotic, like scattered puzzle pieces she couldn't put together. The trial had robbed her not only of her home and her son, but also of the image of the perfect wife and mother that she had so carefully created. She tried calling Jake, texting him, leaving voicemails, begging for a chance to explain herself, but he didn't answer. Thomas ignored her calls, too, and each refusal was a blow she couldn't soften. One day, standing outside her apartment window, she saw a photo on social media posted by Jake's friend Mike. It showed Jake laughing as he threw a basketball into the backyard of his new home. Thomas was standing next to him, his hand on his son's shoulder, and they both looked happy. Rachel felt her eyes fill with tears. She knew she had ruined that happiness herself, with her own hands, with her own choices. Dan, Steve, the others, they had been her escape from the loneliness, from the emptiness she felt when Thomas drove away, leaving her alone. But now she saw that that escape had cost her everything. She tried to justify herself, first to herself, then to her lawyer, then in letters she sent to Thomas that came back unread. She wrote that she hadn't meant to hurt anyone, that she was simply lost, that she still loved them. But the words felt empty, even to her. She knew Jake had seen her with those men, knew she was lying, and that truth was like a knife she had stabbed into their family. Sometimes she drove past their new house without stopping, just to look. She saw Jake leaving the house with a backpack, Thomas loading the car before work. They moved on, without her, and each moment was a reminder of what she had lost. She wanted to fight, she wanted her son back, but every time she thought about the trial, about those videos, about Jake's words, her resolve melted. She knew she had no right to ask for forgiveness, not now, when the pain she had caused was still so fresh. Thomas stood in the backyard of their new house, watching Jake practice with a ball. The basketball hoop they had installed together had become a ritual for them. They came out there every evening to play, laugh, talk. Today, Jake was in good shape, his throws were accurate, and he even allowed himself to tease his father. "Dad, have you ever played basketball?" he yelled, throwing the ball into the hoop. "You're like a retired old man." Thomas laughed as he intercepted the ball. "Hey, this old man will give you a head start yet. Watch and learn." He threw the ball, and to Jake's surprise it went straight into the hoop. Jake whistled, his eyes lighting up. "Okay, maybe you're not completely hopeless." They played until it was dark, until the sky turned a deep blue and the stars began to appear over the city. When they finally walked into the house, both out of breath and sweating, Thomas felt like he was breathing freely for the first time in a long time. A new home, a new routine, a new life. This wasn't just a beginning, it was a promise he'd made to himself and to Jake. Later, when Jake went to his room to call his friends, Thomas sat on the couch with a mug of coffee and opened his laptop. He had received an email from the realtor. The old house had been sold, and the money had already been deposited into the account. He closed his eyes, imagining how their old cottage, full of memories, would now become someone's new beginning. He didn't feel regret, only relief. He knew the past would haunt them for a long time. Jake was still seeing a therapist, and sometimes his eyes would become distant, as if he were remembering those nights he had seen his mother with strange men. But Thomas saw other things, too, his son laughing, trusting again, making plans for the future. And that was what he was willing to do anything for. He looked out the window, where the lights of the city reflected, and thought of Rachel. He knew she was out there somewhere, alone, trying to pick up the pieces of her life. Part of him wanted to feel sorry for her, but another, stronger part reminded him that she had made a choice. And now he was making his own to protect Jake, to build him a home without lies, without fear. He would never let anyone destroy their family again, even if that family now consisted of just the two of them. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.